I'm going to go ahead and jump in because there is a whole lot of stuff that I want to get to today. So hopefully our technology works and we don't have any huge problems, although it's okay if we do too, because this is the new world order. This is the world that we live in now. So this is the third installment of Mind Movement Addiction webinar. It's very, very rare that we get the opportunity to offer a free webinar to anyone and everyone. So I really enjoy talking on this topic to, the average person as opposed to other clinical professionals. It's kind of a refreshing thing that I get to do. And it's exciting for me because I don't get to talk about this topic so much anymore. After working in mental health or after working in substance use treatment from going back to the 1990s, more recently, I've spent most of my time in mental health primary. And so it's a real honor and treat for me to get to speak on this topic also. So today we are going to actually veer into the underpinnings of addiction. And before we get started, I want to make a couple of things very clear. First and foremost, when you think about drugs and alcohol, think about them in terms of the solution and not the problem. I think so often especially if we have loved ones that are active in their substance abuse or addiction, we tend to think that um, when they stop drinking or using, then the problem will go away. And the truth is, that's typically just the very, very first, that's the beginning. That's like the first part of moving into um, a real solution that really works over the long term. But you want to try to start to begin to think differently about drugs and alcohol. Most people use drugs and alcohol because they are very effective at controlling our mood. So what they do is they are ultimately the solution. So for someone who's had a long-standing love affair with drugs and alcohol, or who has a problem, or who engages in substance abuse frequently, they know that there's this thing out there that they can take at any moment and feel a lot better from. And so, for the average person, maybe put yourself in the position where you're going to a wedding or you're walking into some big reception hall where maybe you don't know a lot of people. And what's the first thing that most people do when they get to a party where they don't know anybody, right? They go right to the open bar or they go right to the bar, whether it's open or not. And that's because we all know that, even if it's just a shot of vodka or a couple sips of a glass of wine, that couple of sips is so potent that it almost immediately gives us some kind of reaction at the level of the body. So it calms down the nervous system. And that immediate reaction is exactly what those that have a problem with substances are seeking. Now, what starts out as something that is very enjoyable, that kind of makes a fun situation even more fun, or brightens up a gloomy day, or just eases our social anxiety at a party, goes from just that, to being so reliable that we sort of know that we can manipulate how we feel at any time with these substances. And as I always say, remember, these are the trump cards of mood altering chemical experiences that exists in the world. So there's nothing stronger than drugs and alcohol. This is it. These are the trump cards of pleasurable experience. So there is nothing on earth that really comes into the same stellosphere that you could do organically, that doesn't involve taking a mood altering substance that's going to give you a comparable feeling. And so the only thing, if you've never engaged in any substance use at all, the only thing that's going to get you even close is love. So the experience of being in love is as close as you're going to get to what drugs and alcohol do to the mind and body. Now, different drugs work more similarly to love specifically than others, but that's about the strongest organic or natural experience we're going to have in life that gets you into the same league or category as drugs and alcohol, or as in terms of the way you're going to feel as a result. Now, that actually is an important detail, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but it's an important detail. It's important to know that, in fact, love, that pleasure center where love exists in the brain, is exactly what makes us as human beings. That's what makes us addiction prone. It's what puts us at risk for developing an addiction, because addiction goes into the same chemistry in the brain that love is responsible for, and it hijacks it. And for lots of people that maybe have anxiety around in social situations, or when it comes to interpersonal relationships, so love relationships, close friendships, family dynamics, if those kinds of close relationships give you anxiety, then when you take a drug or you take alcohol, you now are at a higher risk of developing a problem with that substance, because of the relief that it is giving you in that exact area of the brain. Now, if somebody does not have interpersonal anxiety, if they don't, if they don't get extremely anxious around other people, they may not be as prone to turn to substances, because instead of getting the ease and enjoyment, what they're focused on is that sense of feeling out of control, maybe feeling nauseous, or all of the more negative side effects that come with substances. So, that doesn't mean that in every case where someone has anxiety, they're going to be addicted to something. Absolutely not. It's just starting to help you to understand the landscape in terms of what maybe separates someone that does end up going down that road from somebody who maybe doesn't. So, and it's worth just mentioning here that the reason, and we're going to get into this in 1 minute, everything in psychology, it really comes down to the mind and body. It really comes down to the survival drives. It comes down to physiology. So, one point I want to make before we jump right into understanding physiology and how that really puts us at high risk for drug and alcohol addiction. Before we get to that, I just want to also mention one of the reason why we decided to offer an addiction webinar now is because these types of really stressful experiences, these large scale, I mean, certainly a freaking, a threat to our health that's lingering, an invisible threat that's lingering outside, certainly is terrifying. And then being inside all the time is adding another layer of stress and anxiety. And then not having employment, or not knowing how long we're going to be in this situation for, or not knowing when the economy is going to, come back full force. All of this, right? The loss of loved ones, all of this additional emotional upheaval that's going on right now, essentially is stealing all of that extra bandwidth that we all have to deal with life. So, we were just going about our normal lives and we adjust. So, in other words, each of us has what's called distress tolerance, or kind of like a barrier or a layer of extra energy that we use and we tap into to deal with things that bother us, to deal with things that are irritating, to deal with a text from a boss that seems really off-putting, to deal with emails about a bill that's late, to deal with slow lines at the grocery store. We all have an extra reserves for that. But now that has been used up by all of this additional anxiety that just exists, period, in the ethers right now. So it doesn't really matter what position you've taken on this, doesn't matter what your politics are, doesn't matter, how scared you are or not. It's taking our reserves, and you can see it everywhere you look. You can see it on the streets, you can see it in the grocery stores, people snapping at each other. You might even be seeing it in your home, dealing with loved ones. So it's important for this conversation because what's happening is people, of course, naturally turn more to substances to calm down, to relax. And so what we're seeing, and you can see it here on the screen for those of you that can see the screen, it alcohol use has risen 55%. That's based on a survey that was given out since this started over the last 3 months. We're also seeing huge spikes in domestic violence phone calls to these domestic violence nonprofit hotlines. And we know that they go hand in hand. I used to work with the NYPD as a counselor, and they would always tell me that they'd never been on what they call a domestic. They've never shown up for a domestic argument when there wasn't alcohol involved. So the thing to be aware of here is when there's more anxiety, alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It relieves the anxiety, and it does so with perfection. It is a perfect anxiety reducer. Now, that's what you need to know about drugs and alcohol, right? They're so freaking good at their job that if somebody is having anxiety, if somebody's having depressive symptoms, if they're just feeling like life is not the way they want it to be, and they turn to drinks or they turn to maybe even a pill that a doctor is giving them, the threat there is it is so effective, right? It's so freaking effective. And that's the reason why we're having this conversation now. We want to help people understand what addiction really is, and that there is a whole other world of options besides turning to drugs and alcohol to feel okay. But the main point here is very, very important. Many people think that they're going to stop using drugs and alcohol, and then that's going to cure the problem. And the truth is, that actually can make the problem bigger in the short term, because the drugs were not really the problem. They were the solution. They were the thing that the person was turning to feel better. And now that you've taken my medicine away, I'm not okay. And so typically we do see in those early stages, things feel a lot more difficult before they feel better. Now, biopsychology, which is also referred to as behavioral neuroscience, that is really what mind movement is all about. So the main thing that separates mind movement, what we do, from other treatment modalities is exactly that, is that everything that we do is founded in this thing called biopsychology. Now, what does that really mean? That's a fancy word. What the hell is that saying? What that's really saying is it has to do with the way that we look at a human being. So when I look at a person in front of me who comes to me and is struggling emotionally, or they tell me they have a mental illness, or they've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder or anxiety or whatever it is, I know I don't look at that as an emotional problem. I don't look at that as a psychological problem. I look at that as a whole system problem. That's a mind and body problem as one system. So when we talk about mental health, when I use that phrase, I'm really also talking about physiology. I am talking about the body. And this is a critical point that if you never, remember anything I say ever again, here is the really important piece. As a mental health professional, we've been trained not to have to care much about biology. So, you maybe take a few classes in social work school, maybe, we all have to go through some form of brain science, maybe in one class that's mandatory. But even those teachers are often sort of like discouraging that, of you really paying close attention. It's like, yeah, you kind of have to know this stuff in the background, but don't worry about it. You're not going to be dealing with what, brain surgery, whatever. But the problem here is, in fact, that's not exactly true. Although we're not going to be cutting someone open, you if you don't understand the mind and body as one system, that's like you're being handicapped as a professional, because it is one system. And the sooner that you can begin to understand that every thought that we have occurs at the level of the brain and is an electrical current that is altering neurochemistry, which is altering biology. So that's really important to begin to understand. Why is that important? Well, think about drugs of abuse, or think about even an antidepressant or any drug that you have ever put in your body, whether it's Tylenol or anything. The way that those medications are working, you put them through, usually, you put a pill in your mouth, you put it into the stomach, it then begins to break down and gets absorbed into the body to ultimately target neurotransmitter activity, changes in your neurotransmitter system, in your inner chemistry, that then causes a different psychological or emotional experience, even to the degree that maybe it's just ibuprofen, but it's blocking pain. So it's not that you don't have the pain, it's that you're blocking your ability to experience the pain. So it's not that the pain just went away, it's that you no longer are experiencing it as painful. Now, that happens when we put something in, but it also happens with our attention. In other words, every place that I give my focus is also serving as a mood altering experience. It is essentially doing the same exact thing as taking a drug or taking ibuprofen. It's just that we don't realize that that's what we're doing, because we've been trained that the mind and body are separate. Conversely, and you guys know this, right? If you're starving, if you're so hungry, you could eat a house, whatever, your mind goes crazy. You start to get agitated, you start to get irritated, you start thinking about food, you start getting short with the people around you, because you're hungry. So, as you are well aware, the mind is also heavily influenced by what's going on with the body. And that's because we are one system with no separation. So when people say, oh, well, my son has a chronic ankle injury, and the doctors can't find any explanation for that, is it all in his head? It's so, and then essentially that implies that it's not a real injury, it's not a physical thing, it's a mental thing. And the reality is, we now know that they're not separatable, that it's always a mental thing and it's always a physical thing, which is not an answer that most people like, because we've been trained in this myth of separation. So what does that mean? What is the myth of separation? So actually, believe it or not, going back to the 1600s, this French philosopher, who many of you have heard of before, named Rene Descartes, this was back at the history of science. This is where modern science began. So these were our first scientists, really, in the modern age. And they wanted to study biology, and they knew that they had reached a limitation without cutting open the human form. So in order to advance science, scientifically, we needed to start to do cadaver research. And that was the really strong feeling of Rene Descartes around 1640. So the problem was, though, the church, who was in charge at that time, didn't love, or historically had not been okay with desecration of flesh. So Rene had to go to the church and make a sound argument that the soul had left the body anyway. So when a person is dead, it's just rotting flesh. It's not really a person anymore, because the soul has left. Now, the church accepted that and gave them the green light to start to do that cadaver research. However, on one condition, on a condition that there then begin a campaign of separation between the mind and the body. Descartes said, look, we, us scientists, we're going to take all things material, all things with physical, made up of matter, all things that have form and structure, everything from a rock and a table to a human body. But you, the church, can have all things invisible. You can have all things spirit, i.e., the mind and the mental, because it was believed that that's what our thinking was, that the human experience was really a spirit in a body. And so because of that marketing campaign, it did an amazingly effective job of saying the church is going to be the foremost leader in our understanding of all things mind and mental and spiritual, and science will take all things matter and material. And that then has stood until right now. Believe it or not, that is why it is so hard for us to not see these two things as one thing. It's why it's so hard and takes years for people to unlearn what they've been taught, which is that the mind and body are separate, because they're not. Now, what the hell does this have to do with anything, Sam? Well, this is really important because everything, and especially when we're talking about mental health, comes down to these two survival drives. So everything in mental illness, which I don't even like to say, but symptoms of mental illness come down to maladaptive or unhelpful brain wiring because of these survival drives. Now, the two survival drives in the way that we like to present this information is one, the body's drive to keep you alive. So you have kind of like an automatic kind of like threat button that gets pushed, whether before you're even aware of it. That threat button gets detected by your sensory system, and the body begins to go into threat mode. It's the emergency, like, safe fail button, so to keep you alive. So that is number one, keep the body alive. Number two, which might seem a little bit odd, right, at first glance, what do you mean connection? Hold on, guys. My dog, come here, you. So this is Sunny. She's a 3-pound Chihuahua puppy. So at first glance, what does connection have to do with survival? Well, actually, everything comes down when it comes to our human internal and innate drives. We have within us a very real drive to connect with other human beings. Now, why would that be? Well, there's two very, very obvious reasons. One is for procreation, to continue to, to continue to have the species carry on, right? To have sexual relations, to continue the species. The other, along the same lines, is to make sure that we nurture the species. So as a mom, you have within you the resources to connect with your baby right after the baby is born. This is what in love looks like. In love is essentially a byproduct of, a flooding of oxytocin and dopamine in the brain that tells you to take care of your small child no matter what. I mean, that is what keeps us as parents able to tolerate our very difficult babies most of their lives, right? Until they're now into their 20s, really. So that is another byproduct of this drive to connect. But the third one is harder to see now, a lot more obvious when you think back to the hunter and gatherer days. When we were hunter and gatherers, we could not survive on our own. We needed the tribe. And so the tribe was also an indirect survival drive. So connection is number two, only to stay alive, keep the body alive. Now, why is that important? As I said, because you can look at all what we would call mental illness, right? So all behavior that is either unexplainable, or all behavior or physical manifestations that are unexplainable by modern science, or that are abnormal. So typically, the way mental illness is considered mental illness is because it's outside of the bell curve. It's outside of what we consider that 80% to look like. So always, mental illness is never helpful. Very rarely is it helpful. It almost always creates challenges in someone's ability to exist in a functional way in the world. So that's why I have it written here as maladaptive, unhelpful to our ability to succeed and move forward, right? So, but what happens with mental illness in the way that we think of it, it's really like a direct byproduct of how the brain has wired as a result of some system of defense to these basic primary drives. Now, I know that's very sort of jargony and all of that, so you don't have to worry about what I just said too much right now. It will very much make sense, I promise, as we go through. But in psychology, it's referred to in some circles as coupling, which just means that the brain has wired in unhelpful habits and patterns of thought and emotion that don't serve us. And the thing to keep in mind here is oftentimes these defenses are very effective when we're young. So oftentimes these habits and patterns at the level of the brain have helped us tremendously through childhood. They kept us safe. They kept us feeling, they kept us feeling like we were going to be okay. The problem is, and we see it all the time, when someone has to then take on more and more responsibility and move into adulthood, that's where you will typically see all kinds of problems emerge, because now those same patterns and habits that kept them safe as a child are not serving them into adulthood. They don't work. Those protections have now become a great disadvantage. So this is not necessarily in every single case of mental illness, but it certainly is extraordinarily common. And what is the same in cases of mental illness is this wiring. It's the thing to keep in mind, though, and I want to really make this clear, we're using language that is just that, it's just language. So mental illness is not like a broken knee where, I can break my knee and go to a doctor. The doctor's going to see the broken knee on an X-ray or in an MRI. Then they're going to look to fix the broken bones, and hopefully after X amount of time in a cast and then some physical therapy, I'm back to walking on my knee or using my knee to walk. That's not what mental health is. That's not what mental illness is. In fact, these maladaptive habits and patterns, the level of our thinking, are extremely common, extremely common. So although we're using these terms like mental illness more and more, people are starting to really understand that these thoughts, these habits, these ways of thinking are really in all of us. They're just more pronounced or on a continuum, more extreme in those that struggle with mental health challenges. So it's like we all have the same kind of habits and patterns. It's just that for some of us, they've become extreme and over inflated or are to the point where they are now affecting our ability to move on in our lives. So there's three important myths that I want to talk about as we continue to move in the direction of really understanding addiction. The first is, as I already talked about, this myth of separation, which I mentioned already, and that just comes down to this idea in our culture that the mind and body are separate, of which they are not. Now, one other point I want to make about this, the whole reason that mind movement happened, the whole reason that we decided to move forward with building this company, myself and my colleagues, was because of this myth of separation. After working in treatment for many, many years, we found that because of the split, because mental health professionals are not being trained enough at the level of the biology and physiology, and medical professionals are not being trained enough at the level of the mind, we have this split. And what we saw were clients falling into this kind of abyss, or this place where they're becoming labeled as treatment resistant, or they're repeat offenders, or going in and out of multiple treatment programs, because there's a blind spot in our system that does not understand how this mind and body system work together. And once you do understand how they work together, those same people who the system, seems like it's failing terribly, all of a sudden have a much easier time because they're being looked at differently. So it's nobody's fault. It's more just a systematic or a systemic problem that goes back hundreds of years. So what do I mean exactly? And I'm going to give you a very important example that has to do with anxiety. Okay, so anxiety, what does anxiety mean? Anxiety really refers to kind of two things. One, the speed of our thoughts, and two, how we feel. So we know, right? Anxiety and excitement feel exactly the same, and they're both really, they're the same thing. They're both central nervous system stimulants. So you're feeling stimulated, you're feeling excited. But with excitement, it's a happy feeling. It's like butterflies and, giddiness. And with anxiety, it's fear. It's the same kind of systemic stimulation. It's that same uppityness at the level of the body. But the story, the narrating in the mind is, right, there's some kind of threat. Now, important to know, the body really only has one system for survival. So it doesn't make the distinction between, a bear outside on your front porch and you worrying about the rent for next month. The body doesn't see them as separate. It just says, oh my God, there's a threat and I'm going to kick into gear. So the thing that most people don't know, just simply because they're not trained, and the only reason that I know is just from, a lot of seeking, just constantly seeking answers, is because for years and years and years, is because so think about when that system, when your fear system, often called fight or flight or freeze in psychology, I'm sure you've heard that sentence before, fight or flight, which just means, right, your automatic survival button has been pushed, and now you are in a state of hypervigilance or assessing your environment for a potential threat. Now, this is important because, like I said, it doesn't matter what is activating that threat system. It could be a legitimate threat to your safety, or it could be the way that you're perceiving your experience. Somebody walks by you on the street and you think that they're talking about you, or that they are staring at you or saying something in their minds negatively about you, or that they want to hurt you, and maybe they were just not thinking about you at all, just innocently walking by. But the story in your head is something different. Now, the body doesn't react differently in one case or the other. It's just reacting to what it experiences as a threat. And that's really important because there's really only two conditions with which the body takes over the mind. And what I mean by that is it gets hijacked. So your mental experience, your thoughts, And then your emotions as a result of your thoughts have become taken over by the physical experience, that survival drive. And that is under threat of extinction. So when you get afraid, anytime that you get afraid, right, as soon as we do that, that is sending the signal to the brain, there's a threat. And at that moment, the body has been hijacked. The mind has been hijacked by the body. Now, all of your kind of like basic common sense, high level reasoning, real ability to solve complicated problems, your best thinking has just left, it's gone now, because the body is going into survival mode, and survival mode doesn't give a crap about algebra and your ability to solve high level math problems. It just goes into fight or flight. Should I stay and try to fight? Should I survey how my likelihood of getting away, or should I freeze where I am? What do I do? And so because of that, the mind is no longer operating as it normally is. Your perception, all of your senses get taken over, and now all you're doing is a threat assessment. Is that a threat? Is that a threat? Is that a threat? Is that a threat? And you don't know that, of course. So when you think about, and I'll give you just a couple examples, I'm not going to get too much further into this, but if you think about people who have OCD, they have hand washing, where they need to obsessively wash their hands. So one of the things that happens when that system is activated at the level of the mind is we start to focus, hyper focus on the body. Because if there was, let's say we did have a broken bone or a real injury, we would have to be able to factor that in to survive. So what oftentimes happens when people get anxious, they develop body tics. Some people might pull out their hair or look at themselves in the mirror and judge their body in horrible ways. Wash hands, or any number, right? Skin pick. There's all kinds of things that people will do when they're anxious that involves the body. And again, of course, because or people that think they're having a heart attack. That's another really common one, because we start to hyper focus on the body as soon as that threat activation system goes off. And again, if you don't understand that that's a byproduct of the body, that's not a mental thing, the body has just taken over. If you don't know that, then you might not realize the answer or the way out to help somebody get out of that kind of skin picking, or pulling out their hair, or obsessive hand washing and those kinds of things. You may not see that the way out occurs at the level of the body. That's not an emotional problem, that's a physical problem, that's a body problem. Now, of course, as I already said, they come together. Their mind is also part of the body and vice versa. So, right? So we effectively have to treat both, of course. But again, if you don't know that, then you might misread what's happening. And what could be a very simple intervention that helps somebody get better very quickly is overlooked, because there's not an awareness of that relationship between our mental experience and our physiology. So this is why this myth of separation is very dangerous. And ultimately, it's why we made the decision to leave traditional treatment models and move into the realm of treating both the mental and the physical simultaneously, or treating the physical as part of clinical work, as part of the mental health. So there is a very long-standing history beyond just the Descartes situation, but we're not going to get into it any further here. Just see, yep, we don't need to go through that. The other thing that I just want to mention is what we call the myth of invisibility. So another really serious challenge that our culture faces is that we've sort of been taught that the mind, our mental experience, our thoughts, really don't matter. That what matters is what we can see and what we do. So, we're sort of taught that um, it doesn't really matter if nobody else sees it, then it's no big deal. It's what other people can see that really matters. It's our behavior that matters. Now, psychology has this huge hang up on this and has since its inception. Again, it's another side effect of the myth of separation, which we're not going to get into right now, but don't get me started, I guess. But it's important because you would think that psychology, right, the study of thought, that's what it would be. But it's really became about behavior. Even to the degree that if you turn over your health insurance card and you look on the other side, the back side, you will see not mental health. You won't see a number for mental health. You'll see a number for what? Behavioral health. Why? Because psychology chose to go the road of behavior over the mental. Why? Because it's far more measurable. So, although thoughts are discussion in psychology, right, the cognitive part, psychology chose to focus on behavior, and people are more comfortable with the discussion about behavior because it's more tangible, it's more measurable. But here's the problem: behavior is almost irrelevant to our mental health. Yes, that's right. Right. Why? Because the behavior comes so far later, becomes so far later that by that point, the habits at the level of the mind are already established. So, what do I mean? The most important, the most important variable in all of our lives is your inner dialogue, is your thinking, is your thoughts. Now, we have between 40 to 80,000 thoughts a day, give or take. There's different arguments about how many we actually have. So there's a big margin of error there. But we have several thousand thoughts a day. Now, think back to your thoughts today. How many of those thoughts do you actually remember? Probably very few, because we're not trained or taught to pay very close attention to our thinking. We think what matters is the environment, our circumstances, what people see, what we do, and our behavior, what we do. But in actuality, what builds our reality is our thinking. It's the narrating, it's the story we're telling about our circumstances and about behavior. So the behavior is kind of a secondary, or arguably even a tertiary kind of function of first our mental generating, our thinking, and then our emotion that typically comes as a result of our thinking. And then there's a whole other cycle that we are going to talk about in a little bit. So, but the point to really focus on right now, thoughts are super, super important. And unfortunately, due to what some of you are very well versed in, the negativity bias, due to that survival drive, our need for survival, we tend to focus on the negative in our environment over the positive at like a 5-to-1 ratio. So in the end, you wind up with about an 80% to 20% split of negative thinking to positive thinking. And that, of course, is what really amounts to depression and ultimately, oftentimes, anxiety, which are the two hallmark symptoms of most expressions of mental illness. So, including addiction. So, this is all really, really important because by the time someone has picked up a problem, by the time someone has become habituated to drug and alcohol use, their mental life is so utterly, horrifically negative. Their sense of self-worth is so utterly, horrifically negative that it becomes it's like gasping for air, staying afloat, and using substances to continue to try to stay afloat in their lives. And so, that's what I mean when I say that drugs and alcohol are a symptom. They're not the problem itself. The problem is happening at the level of thought, and then emotion, and then behavior eventually. Let me just do a quick time check. Okay. One more thing I want to mention. We're not going to get super into the myth of continuity. This is something that we could talk about for a really long time. But this is Dr. Anil Seth. He is one of our leaders in the world on understanding consciousness and perception. And the only thing I want you to sort of like take away from what I'm about to say, we tend to think that we're all having the same experience within reason. So we tend to think that, we all see pretty much the same thing, that we're kind of these neutral observers of the world around us, and we come in as neutral observers. Someone then gives us language. They teach us, oh, this is a window, that's a table, this is water, this is a dog, right? They teach us what things are, and then we just all experience the same thing, right, for the most part. That we are these neutral, that our senses just observe what is, and that's it. We learn what things are, and that's how it is. Unfortunately, though, not the case at all. That's entirely false. It's far more a two-way street. What we actually see and hear and taste and touch and smell is far more colored with our beliefs, our thoughts, our expectations. So our worlds are very specific to us, very specific to us. We're selecting as we go along what meaning, how to define what it is we're coming into contact with. And then we're wiring it in to a larger system at the level of the brain. And we don't know that we're doing that, but we're doing it all the time. It's why you could have, and the most obvious examples are things like politics. It's why you could have two people watching the exact same speech and both walk away saying almost the exact opposite from one another, right? And believing it and being steadfast in their conclusion that they are right. Well, yeah, from this person's perspective, they are right. And from that person's perspective, if I saw it through their eyes, I would think I was right too from that framework. So it's not that we're all seeing everything the same way and everything is what it is and that's it. It's a dance, and we're building uniquely to us. And that's really important. What that means is going from a mental illness, whether it's addiction or anything else, means telling a new story, building a new highway system in the brain, as opposed to what we've been doing. So instead of using the system of circuitry that we've been relying on all this time, we've got to start building a new perceptual experience and then using that over and over again until those new reactions are automatic. So what does that mean practically? Overcoming addiction and any mental health challenge comes down to the same system as riding a bike. That's it. It is really no different. Riding a bike is challenging, right? Actually, it's pretty amazing how much symmetry has to be happening at the level of the body and the mind in order to effectively ride a bike. But, we fall down. Maybe it takes us like half a day, maybe a couple of days at most. But eventually we keep trying to get back on, and all of a sudden it clicks like that. The body and mind figure out how to do it, and then we don't have to learn it again. That's how so much of our experience is, because of habituation, because of energy conservation, which we're not going to get to today. But this is important because mental health comes down to the same exact thing. It comes down to wiring in a new experience that eventually becomes how you experience the world automatically. And how quickly it takes for someone to really overcome their mental health challenge depends on how much effort they're putting into this new or different way of being and experiencing. Now, addiction is unique and fascinating because of this. Addiction itself, the what we remember, what the body, what the human experience, what we remember, really think about it again in terms of survival, comes down to the strength of the intensity of the emotion of an experience. Because if you have really strong emotion, better or for worse, the body says, oh, this is important to my survival. Can't forget this thing, right? So it's inside of you. You may not be conscious of those memories, but they're in there. And drugs and alcohol are so strong. They are so rewarding. They kill pain essentially so effectively. And I don't just mean painkillers. I mean, they literally, in terms of like pleasure and pain, which is what the reward system essentially comes down to, they are so rewarding that they map on in a really strong way to your nervous system. In other words, just like you would never expect to forget your first love, you might want to forget them, but you can't. Or maybe your best friend from high school, or a family member that you're really close to. You can't forget those things because they are hardwired in. They are meaningful to you. They are intense. They have a strong strength of experience. And that is what drugs and alcohol do as well. So, because of their strength, because of how intense they are, they're very difficult to just forget or walk away from. So, in order to begin the process or the road to recovery, one has to, number one, temporarily, doesn't have to be forever. Like, this isn't an argument for the abstinence forever is the only way model of recovery. But it is in order to essentially build those new wires at the level of the brain and the body. Putting down the substances for a period of time is critical, because the body's just going to keep getting hijacked by the strength of the intensity of those chemicals and of the mood altering experience if it doesn't. And so you never get any traction to develop a new habit. For anyone who's ever abused substances, it's just like when you try to go to the gym, and I see this all the time. Like, let's say January rolls around, someone who maybe abuses alcohol decides, I'm gonna, go on the wagon for the month of January, and I'm gonna go to the gym every day. And they do it. They're able to do it effectively. But of course, inevitably, whether it's 2 weeks, a month, a couple of months later, they start drinking again. And of course, the first thing that goes is that commitment to the gym, because it is very difficult to hardwire in a new habit when someone is actively engaging in drug and alcohol use. That destabilizing effect that they have on the nervous system and their strength of intensity of reinforcement is what really makes it so hard for someone to recover while they're still actively using. And so this isn't an argument one way or the other for what kind of recovery track someone goes down. But to understand that the science of it is really important for our success. And at the end of the day, I'm very practical. I just want people to succeed at whatever it is they're trying to do. And so for any kind of real recovery experience, a period of balance without the ups and downs of substance use is a critical variable. So Unfortunately, we are just about at time. If does anybody have any questions? If you have a question, please, you can go ahead now and type it into the Q&A. You can also email me at info@mindmovement.com. I'm happy to answer any and all questions that anyone has. Next time we're going to continue this conversation about looking at environmental variables and factors that affect addiction. We're going to look at how it behaviorally manifests. So we're going to talk about the personality of addiction and what you will see on the outside that can help tip you off that someone is stuck in that hijacked brain caused by using substances and the brain being hijacked by that repeated use. So if you have any questions, please send them to me. I thank you so much for your time and your attention. As I said earlier, it's such an honor to be able to speak on this topic. I don't get to do it very much anymore. And to anyone who has any family members or questions about loved ones, again, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer any and all questions for you. Okay, everybody have a great night. Take care. Be well. Stay safe.